My name is Steve Utek, founder and CEO of Illumyx. So welcome to the Illumyx CultureCast. Here at Illumyx, we're passionate about how human beings work. And each month we bring you an expert in the field of leadership, team development, and culture change to help enlighten you, educate you about the latest and greatest to best impact human beings' lives. So before we get started and before I introduce you to our guest, I have a couple of housekeeping issues I want to clear up. So if you look at the bottom of your screen and hover over the bottom panel, you'll see a button that says Q&A. So as questions arise today, enter your questions into that box, and we will get to those the last 5 to 10 minutes of the show. Also, today is going to be more interactive than shows in the past, so we're going to use the chat function. So at various points in time, we're going to pause the show and actually have you guys toss in your comments so we can get a pulse for where you guys are at with the content and what you guys are learning and picking up. So let's actually practice that right now. So see, everybody, if you want to click the chat box and then enter in your name and where you're from. We got Lauren from Denver, Chua from Green Bay, and from Green Bay, a lot of Northeast Wisconsin folks. Oh, Terry from Minneapolis, welcome. Sean from Wisco Dells, Lori from Appleton. Joey from Jonesboro, representing the South. Leah, Jason, and Melissa from Jonesboro. Brittany from Minnesota. Excellent. Okay, cool. This works. Excellent. Well, really excited. So today's topic is called the business of listening. My wife has told me a few times this is a skill I could improve upon. We have with us today Dana Dupuis. She's the founder and developer of the Echo Listening Profile. I have her right here on the screen. So Dana, how about you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from, and how you got here.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. So just a typical leadership communication background, and along the way we realized that a lot of our content was about how people spoke, and we really felt like there was something missing. So we started to look into how listening played a part in leadership development, and it grew very quickly. As a matter of fact, all of our clients said that was the most interesting part of our content. So little by little, the listening portion of our development became the main portion of our development until we finally now really teach listening intelligence as our primary content.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating because when I heard about what you guys do, I'm like, a listening profile. I've heard of a ton of behavioral profiles out there or personality profiles, and I've never heard of a listening profile so that you can actually diagnose how you listen and your preference and style. So really fascinated to learn more today. Cool. So Dana, where are you going to be taking us? So what do we hope to cover? Whether or not we cover that is up for debate, but.
That's right. So let's look at our roadmap today. We're going to look at listening, which we call the other 50% of the communication equation. We're going to look at the 4 ways we listen, because we know people listen to and for different information. And then we're going to look at developing a culture of listening intelligence. And hopefully, depending on how you and I interact, we'll get through all of that.
It's debatable, but that's part of the fun of this. So Dana, what do you mean by, the listening being the other 50% of the communication equation? So I want to hear more about that from you. Yeah,
sure. So in 2016, Fortune 500 companies had an estimated loss of $37 billion in poor communication. Our belief from our research stated that 95% of corporate individuals that were interviewed believed that the speakers drove the communication equation. And so this to us was a real problem because we know that speaking plus listening equals communication.
Yeah, and that's how I was always taught. Like, communication is all about talking.
That's right. So if we move this slide along, Stephen, we'll look at something that's kind of interesting about listening. We hear with our ears, but we listen with our brains. And we do know through quite a bit of research that no two brains are alike. So therefore, we recognize and take in information differently. Let me ask you this. Have you ever been to a meeting with maybe 8 other people, high stakes, you're really concerned about what's getting shared, and you all walk out with a little different understanding of what just went down?
Yes.
Okay. So the reason this happens is, a lot of people say, well, people weren't paying attention, or there was something that was really drawing them somewhere else. And quite frankly, that could be happening, but most likely it's because everybody's brain is different, and therefore we're taking in information differently. So let's try something here, Stephen. What I'd like to do is share with everyone a story. So I'm going to read a story, and I want to know, what do you hear? So here's what we're going to do. The first thing I want you to think about is facts. I'm going to read you a story, and I want you to listen for the facts in the story. That's F-A-C-T-S, facts.
So Dana, facts are kind of a debatable term in today's culture. So what do you specifically mean by facts?
Okay.
What should we actually be?
Yes. So facts in this situation are mutually observable with no room for debate. So the time of day, the temperature outside. If you look at this picture, it is a wood table. Things that are mutually observable and undisputable.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to read you a story, and all I want you to do is listen for the facts. Marianne was waiting for the bus on a beautiful sunny day. She was headed to the hospital where she had worked for 10 years. When the bus arrived, she got on and took the last seat open. The bus was running 5 minutes late. The hospital where Marianne worked has very little tolerance for tardiness. At the next stop, the bus driver assisted an elderly couple getting off the bus. Marianne looked at her watch. Next, the bus stopped at a local high school, and a group of 5 teenagers got on. At first, they were laughing and joking around, but within minutes, the driver pulled over and made 2 get off. A young woman pulled the rope to signal the driver to pull over. She struggled a bit getting her stroller off. Marianne checked her watch again. Her stomach was in knots. The bus had to stop at a yellow light just south of the hospital. Marianne felt like she was losing her mind. When it finally arrived, 11 people got off the bus, including Marianne. Okay, how'd that go? I know you can't answer me, but did you get the gist of the story listening just for facts?
And for me, I mean, I was listening along. I was acting as a participant. That was a little bit challenging. That was a lot of information flowing through your mouth there. So those are facts. So we know certain individuals listen for facts. But here's the funny thing, Stephen. We're going to do that exercise again with a different set of rules. This time, I'd like everyone to listen to the exact same story. I know it's boring, but I'd like you to listen for only emotion. So what do you mean by emotion?
So emotion is when you hear the story, does it touch you with emotion? Do you feel it? Are the words emotional? So a whole different lens of listening from what we just did. So let me do it again. It's a great story, isn't it?
It is.
Okay. Marianne was waiting for the bus on a beautiful sunny day. She was headed to the hospital where she has worked for 10 years. Remember, emotion, guys. When the bus arrived, she got on and took the last open seat. The bus was running 5 minutes late. The hospital where Marianne works has very little tolerance for lateness. At the next stop, the driver assisted an elderly couple getting off the bus. Marianne looked at her watch. Next, the bus stopped at a local high school, and a group of 5 teenagers got on. At first, they were laughing and joking around, but within a few minutes, the driver pulled over and made 2 get off. A young woman pulled the rope to signal the driver to pull over. She struggled a bit getting a stroller off the bus. Marianne checked her watch again. Her stomach was in knots. The bus had to stop at a yellow light just south of the hospital. Marianne felt like she was losing her mind. When they finally arrived, 11 people got off the bus, including Marianne. So, how did that go? Did you get the gist of that story? Well, the same story, but.
Yeah, that was for me, that was actually much simpler or easier to do the emotional side. I don't know what that says about me.
So what we should do is let's ask everybody to chat in which of those two story lines with the facts or emotion, was it easier to listen when you were listening for facts, or was it easier to listen when you were listening to emotion? Just all we want you to do is chat in the one word, fact or emotion. And if neither, write neither. So let's see what we hear here.
Emotion, emotion.
Fact, 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 emotion. So we really have kind of a split group.
Yeah, 3 and 3.
So Stephen, here's what we know. There are 4 ways we listen, and we're going to go over the 4. 2 of them we just shared with people. So some people really like to listen through the lens of empathy and emotion for others. Some people really like the facts and want to get to conclusions. There are 2 more that we'll share in a little bit, but let's get to some other stuff right now.
Okay.
All right. So this slide is a crazy slide and absolutely true. So what we know is that listening is a brain-based function, as we had talked about, and it misinterprets, misunderstands, or changes 70% of what we hear. But this is done mostly subconsciously. So what happens is whatever we're thinking about, whatever we care about, and whatever we already know when we are listening to the information that is being shared with us shifts the interpretation that we have in our brain. So just recently, a colleague of mine and myself were headed to Philadelphia to be the keynote at ATD. And so as we were preparing, Robin said to me, hey, you know, this is a great talk. Why don't we use polling? Because I think people would love to be interactive. And so I said to her, listen, I'm fine if we do polling, but you've got to manage that whole situation. I don't want to get involved with that. Why don't you just manage it? She said, fine, like no big deal. So 2 weeks prior to our talk, I frantically get a hold of her. I've got people on my staff trying to get a hold of her to say, have you had all the devices shipped to Philly? Do you have the room number? How do you know how many devices to send for the people attending? Like, do you have this thing managed? And she stopped and said, whatever on earth are you talking about? And I said, the polling devices. And she said, Dana, when's the last time you used polling? And I said, well, don't they ship them in, they put them on people's seats, and then they got to be tested. And she said, oh my gosh, it is an application. When they walk in the door, they hold their phone up, they download it, and within 2 to 5 seconds, they are polling with their own phones. So here was a perfect example of how a very normal situation that I hadn't been aware of for a long time, but in my brain, I had a certain idea of what polling meant. I totally misinterpreted and misunderstood what the situation was, which changed my context to the conversation. And off I was to the races with this whole idea of how difficult it was going to be.
So what year did this happen? Was this like 2010, 2005?
This story happened this like February.
Oh, that is beautiful. I absolutely love that.
I hadn't used polling in so long, or when I had used it, I hadn't been managing it. And so my recollection of it was so in the past.
Yeah, so a lot of what we hear then is rooted in our past experiences, and that, or at least that's one of the ways that we filter.
As well as if we're really, really passionate about something, it shifts the way we hear it. So, yeah.
So when I saw this slide, the first thing that popped into mind as a leader is like, oh, this is a little scary, because like if I'm trying to communicate vision, strategy, goals, objectives, like how do I have confidence that I'm effectively like getting what's in my head into other people's heads? And this is telling me, yeah, you're kind of screwed, man. Like maybe not, maybe that's too extreme.
We have to clarify and close a lot of information with people to make sure that we are really on the same trajectory. So
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, where do we go from here?
So let's move this slide along and talk a little bit about listening in a deeper dive. So I'm sure, given the audience that we have, that most individuals have done a different assessment, whether it's Myers-Briggs, which is great, DISC. There are all kinds of just wonderful assessments in our field. A little research we did found out that there are 6,000 assessment tools in leadership development, conversation, communication, the whole field. But what we know is each of them has really been developed for a really a good reason. However, one of the things that we like to talk about is this distinction here. So if we look at Myers-Briggs and we look at DISC, those are what we call either personality or behavioral assessments. And so why that's important is our personality and our behaviors are pretty hardwired to us. So if you had an accountant that one day just said, hey, I really want to move out of this field and I'm going to become a salesperson. If they went into the sales arena, their personality is going to show up the same. They're not going to change who they are. And their behaviors will probably be quite consistent. So when we look at this whole arena of assessments, we've got personality, behavior, and a third area, which we call cognitive. And listening, which we said is a brain-based function, is a cognitive assessment. So that's number one. So what does that have to do with habits? So we said that personality and behavior are hardwired to you. Well, listening is a habit. So not really that easy to shift, but hey, let's try something here. So I want everyone in the audience to put down anything you got in your hands, and I want you to just cross your arms. Here, let's cross our arms, all right? So pretty easy to do, it's a habit. So now uncross your arms and cross them the other way. And you can feel that just, it took a little bit of brain power. I mean, not a lot, but it's a habit. And so you've done it repeatedly and it served you well through the years. And that's how listening works for us. We know that we go to certain places when we listen.
Yeah, that felt really strange for me. So Dana, so I'm going back to the previous exercise. So it was easy for me to listen to maybe the emotional pieces of that story versus the fact-based stuff. So, am I getting ahead of myself? But what does that mean?
Yeah, it just means that kind of like crossing your arms, Stephen, that you, when you are in conversation with others, your tendency is to most likely listen more for how they're doing, what is on their mind, whereas other listeners are actually just listening for where is this going, what are the facts here. So it's likely if you begin to pay attention to how you listen and you attempt to make shifts, which is where we really want to drive us all to, which you'll see in a little bit, it's going to feel a little awkward, almost like it did to cross your arms the opposite way. Awareness of our listening habits empowers us to expand our listening skills. And instead of just falling back into our habits, we can sort of engage in a new way of listening, which we call listening intelligence. And we know that changing our listening impacts more than just what we hear.
What I like the philosophy of listening being a habit as opposed to something like black and white. So some of those personality assessments I always feel like can put people in a box and say, this is who you are, this is how you're always going to be. And this at least gives me hope of like, okay, maybe if fact-based listening isn't a strength of mine, I can at least practice it and get better at it, as opposed to it being a death sentence where like, oh, you're just stuck into the emotional realm, Steve. Nowhere to go from here.
That's right. And Stephen, what we teach people is to start actually strategically setting yourself up for good listening. If you know you're walking into a budgeting meeting, if you know you're walking into a meeting that has the whole team and we're going to shift some policies and people are going to be disrupted by it, we can shift the listening we bring to a different circumstance.
Cool. Well, I'm excited to get more into the 4 habits.
Yeah, so let's do it. So what we're about to do is share our 4 different habits. And so at a high level, the 4 ways we listen from the research we've done is we listen connectively, which focuses on what interactions mean to others.
Now,
Reflective.
with connective, can you give me just a quick example of that?
Absolutely. So a connective listener listens through the lens of, how will this affect my team?
Okay.
How will this affect my family? It's an external type of listening. And then we're going to look at reflective listening, which is an internal type of listening. We reflect on and assess information as it comes in. We actually have a library of experiences. And so as we're assessing information, we can literally say, no, that's not how it happens. That has not happened to me in the past. And we also listen for how this will help us, our career. It's more internal and about us. We'll look at analytical listening, which is what we call facts. Remember, we just did that exercise around facts. So analytical listeners filter what is heard through results and facts. And they are no nonsense, and they just want to get to the facts. And then finally, we'll look at conceptual listening, which filters what they hear through an interest in concepts and possibilities. So they love to brainstorm. So let's move this slide along, Stephen, because I want to give them some, a little bit of information on what we're going to do here. I'm going to walk through each of these 4 listening habits. And as I do, I'd love you to get a piece of paper out and write down connective, leave a little space, reflective, leave a little space, analytical, and conceptual. And as I go through the strengths and challenges of each of these habits, what I'd love everyone to do is just self-diagnose. Just put a check mark when I share with you something that feels like you, and then what we'll do is see what your dominant listening habit looks like.
So Dana, I'm going to hold up at least my scratch paper here. Is this what you're looking for? Like some columns and rows, and they just put check marks whenever they hear something that they relate to or connect with?
That's it.
Perfect.
And of course, everyone probably knows this, how we self-diagnose is quite often different than how others experience us. So this is just a self-diagnosis, kind of a fun little thing we can do. What we also know is these 4 listening habits, we use all 4, but we're just going to look to see if there's one dominant listening habit that you have, or are you a mixture of all 4? So it can be crazy how much these blend into each other. So let's move along, and we'll start with connective. So for the sake of this exercise, I am going to read the slide just to help you not have to read it and think about it. So what we say about connective listeners is they're focusing on what the interaction means to others. They filter what they hear through the interests in other people, groups, processes, and audiences. So their strengths are they provide support and empathy. They appreciate broad application of information. It's not just about them, it's very broad. And they listen for the feelings behind the facts. What we say about a connective listener is they can sit in a meeting and they can notice by the way someone blinks or swallows that they have something to share. And so they can draw it out of other people and build trust very quickly. On the challenges side, they can simply accept information at face value. And what we mean by that is they can be co-opted by who's speaking rather than what's being said. They may forget to look inward to their experiences to say, well, when I did this, it looked like this. So they're always out externally listening. And they may sacrifice facts and data, more about how people feel about things. So I'm going to take a minute and let everybody put their check marks, and then just add those up, and next to connective, put a total number of how many checks you have. And you might have 0. And then let's move on. So reflective listeners, we say they focus on what the interaction means to themselves. They filter what is heard through their own interests and purposes, as well as experiences. On the strengths side, they evaluate direct application. How can I use this information? How will it help me? They relate information to their own situations. This is where I want to head. Will this help me get there? They reflect on personal meaning. And Stephen, I can't read that bottom one. Can you?
Discards non-useful information, it says.
Okay, thank you. I can only, for my screen, I actually can't see the bottom.
Oh.
So on the strength side, what we find with reflective listeners is as they listen to information, they connect it to what they already know and what will be useful in the future. They typically don't share information that is half-baked or a brainstorming, throw it against the wall type of information. So they can be very internal. A lot of times their body language will be where they almost look like they're looking up into their library of experiences because they're really thinking things through. And when they do share, whatever they share is usually very well articulated and locked and loaded because they've thought it all through. Sometimes reflective listeners can be in a meeting and say nothing, and then the next day they'll come back and they have thought it all through because they needed to reflect on it. On the challenges side, they can miss potential application if it doesn't pertain to them. They may be overly introspective where they just can't even share because the conversation in their head is so loud that they don't remember what they've shared with others and what is just in their own internal head. They can ignore meaning for others because to them, they're really thinking through what is important to them. And then I can't read that bottom one.
It says often misses the usefulness of information for other people and or situations.
Great. So the one thing I want to say about reflective dominant listening habits is people can get the wrong impression. It doesn't mean that they're self-absorbed. It doesn't have anything to do with people's personalities. It's just what they listen to and for. So it doesn't show up in their personality. Okay. All right. Once again, please add up your check marks and put a number at your reflective area, and let's move on. Analytical. Somebody who has a dominant analytical listening habit focuses on what the interaction means to an issue or an objective situation, like a goal. They filter what they hear through interests and results and facts. So on the strength side, they discern accuracy of information. They critique information for decision making. So they are listening to information and wondering if it's going to help them get to a goal. They listen for the facts behind the feelings. So if individuals are sharing how they feel about something, they listen behind that to see, is there anything in there that I can pull from that's useful and fact-based? And Stephen, you'll have to read the last one for me.
Controls biases and attitudes.
Yes, so they are not driven or moved by their own emotions. They really, or others, they really are very much driven by getting to results. So on the challenges side, they need to get it right, pretty straightforward. They don't like getting things heading in the wrong direction. They can discard information that could be valuable. So for instance, the facts might be absolutely accurate, but the team might be devastated by where they have to go together, and they just don't even notice that it's going to be extremely difficult to get this team to move in this direction. So they don't even see it. I can't read any further down.
Yeah, the last two are may miss others' feelings, and then can shut off complete interactions.
Yes, so if they are in a meeting and a lot of dialogue is happening that could be emotionally based or just explanations, people sharing their explanations of things, they can just shut right down and go internally to look for facts. So what we see in analytical listeners that they tend to ask questions. They can be the naysayers on the team. They'll say things like, how are we going to do that with the budget? That won't work. They're trying to save time, energy, and get to conclusions. All right, once again, add up your check marks and let's move on to conceptual. Okay, so a dominant conceptual listener focuses on the big picture of ideas, and it's often abstract for them. They filter what they hear through an interest in concepts and possibilities. So on the strength sides, they can comprehend broad views. They get the big picture. They have vision. We see a lot of startup CEOs have conceptual listening. They have big ideas. Pardon me. They use information to stimulate ideas. So as they're hearing things, if you look at this picture, that guy with the wide eyes, that's exactly how they look. They hear information and they think of where they can bring that. They connect ideas to new ideas, so they can share with you something they're thinking, and they go 3 different places in their sharing of that one idea. And Stephen, can I get a little help on that bottom one?
Understands multiple meanings of a message.
Great. So they see patterns, they understand this multiple meanings. So as they see and hear ideas, their ability to put it into different perspectives and possibilities allows them to really broaden their purview of where things might be going. So on the challenges side, they can miss the trees from the forest. So a lot of times we'll hear this kind of conversation from a high conceptual dominant listener. They'll say, this is where I want to go. I don't care how we get there. And if they hear that it's really we're not capable of getting there, they don't want to hear that they just live in possibility. Well, you can figure it out. So they miss the
speaking directly to me.
Oh goodness. They might not get to the point. They get so high up and excited about ideas that the point might be, by this Friday we have to do X. They are out in what X will bring us next to. Then we could do this, then we could do that. Oh my gosh, we could bring the whole company over here. And so they might not get to the point. They can lack focus on the present, which is quite often they're living in that possibility of the future. And then the last one?
May read in more than it actually is meant.
Yes, so because of their ability to live in possibility and take things to the future, something could be just very, very minuscule in its meaning to others, where a high conceptual dominant listener could read into it meaning something very different than it ever meant. Good. Well, so why don't we once again add up the check marks for conceptual listening. Now you should have a number in front of all 4 categories or habits of listening. And let's have a little chat again. Let's see if people can chat in this. Let's know if you have 1 dominant listening habit, dual dominant listening habits, or multiple dominant listening habits. So we're not so interested in what your habit is, but is it just a single dominant listening habit? And we'd love you to chat into us. Is it 2 or more? So 1, we're getting multiple. 1, multiple, yeah. So lots of multiples, a few 1s.
Yeah,
very good.
Multiple.
What did you have, Stephen?
I had a multiple. I had 3 myself. Does that mean I'm schizophrenic or 3. Crazy? I can't make sense out of what to focus on.
Well, it's interesting because when you start to blend them, they look a little different. So what 3 did you have?
I had, my highest was conceptual, and then a tie with connective and reflective.
Okay. So conceptual means you love to brainstorm, but you've got this connective. So you brainstorm with a concern of how others will accept the new ideas, and you have this great library of experiences. So there's a lot of structure in your brainstorming, which keeps an eye on how others will accept it and what has your experience told you. So your brainstorming kind of has bumpers on it, which is wonderful because you have the capability of going there, but you really do it in a way that serves others from your experience. That's really neat. Yeah.
Yeah, that accurately describes me.
Okay. Well, good. So those of you that have actually taken the challenge and done your individual self-diagnosis, and for those of you who have done other personality or behavior assessments, the cool thing about listening is it doesn't matter if you've done Myers-Briggs, DISC, Emergenetics. Those are phenomenal and they tell you how you are. The thing about listening is we can then map this onto your other your other types of assessments, or it can stand alone for anywhere that listening is important. So when we ask people, is listening the right assessment for you? We say, well, I don't know, is listening important in your job? Does it help you get your work done? Is it something that when listening is not at its best, that it's costing the company money? And those are the ways we understand if this assessment would be supportive or not.
Cool. So Dana, one quick question before, because I do want to talk a little bit about culture, but there's a couple of just one dominant habits. So what does that mean if you have one dominant habit versus multiple?
So let's see, what does it mean? So it just means that those of us who have an individual dominant habit is that's really the way we listen. So for instance, we see trends in different lines of business. So in a marketing department, we will see high conceptual listening because it's served them well. They've had to have the ability to really brainstorm with their clients to see where they can bring their clients and maybe their messaging. If you get into an engineering firm or an accounting firm, you most likely will see high analytical listening. And sometimes high analytical listening will go with reflective listening. So since it's a habit and we know that it served you well in the past, there is no right or wrong, Stephen. We see some people who are dominant in one area and we see people who are dominant in all four, which we call a flexor. They all have strengths and challenges to them. And really what we're out to accomplish is for people to see that they have the capacity to shift what kind of listening they bring to what situation, and eventually can observe the listening of others and speak into that.
Love it. Love it.
Yeah.
So one last thing I'd like to get to before we open it up to Q&A is, so we're dealing with culture change, and I know you've been in the trenches working with leaders and teams on listening. Like, give us some stories, some examples around how you've used your methodology for creating awareness around listening to influence change and to create a better either workplace or team dynamic.
Yeah, thanks. So, listening is a cultural game changer for us. It's not something that people would necessarily have their eye on. Well, we as listeners really need to shift. It's not about that, but what we'll see is, we'll get a call from maybe a team. We work with a team locally. It's a team that is built of engineers out of Microsoft as well as a local business here. And so it's a Fortune 500 company, and they blended a few different aspects of companies into one team. And they have very, very short timelines in a lot of their projects. And this happens to be an online marketing team that builds complex stories and complex, I can't think of the word I'm trying to say, like sales initiatives to get people to join in a membership-based online community. And so they're constantly moving very quick, and they've got usually up to 30 different situations going on at once. And so their timelines are very tight, and they've got to get stuff over the goal. And we went in, and there were 7 people on this team. And when we did their listening profiles, it wasn't at all unusual that their conceptual listening, that brainstorming, was off the charts high for the team. What was interesting to us is there was one gentleman who was a total outlier who had analytical reflective listening. And he was sort of the naysayer on the team, and people pushed him away. As a matter of fact, as we started work with this team, the manager of it said, we're thinking of, she said confidentially to me, we're thinking that this gentleman might not be the right fit and we'll have to get rid of him. And so as we observed the team and put them into a group profile, we shared with them that they love to brainstorm, they love to ideate, they had no problem creating solutions, they just didn't know how to get things over the goal line. And with conceptual, they also had high reflective, so they were in their heads a lot. They weren't sharing information, they were baking it all the time. So this one gentleman who had the analytical reflective listening, who was the naysayer, actually through work with our team, openly with their team, to say, we actually need Paul. We need him to help us get things over the goal line because he can structure what we need to do in order to hit Friday's deadline. And so little by little, true story, in the next 6 months of working with this team, we moved Paul out of the team and he became an individual contributor that held on to their budget timeline restraints, and he laid the groundwork for the team and helped them be successful and became pretty much the hero of the team, from being absolutely the sort of the black sheep, if you will. And it was through conversations related to how he listened, how he then thought through things, and where his value could be contributed at a very different level.
That's a pretty amazing story, especially when you have like a really talented individual who's on the verge of getting fired because they're creating some consternation, or there's some consternation in the team, and then they get salvaged because you understand how they fit into the bigger scheme of things, and then they start producing results that weren't possible for us. So that, I love that story. Love that story.
Yeah.
So at this point, I do want to make a quick presentation. So you've offered a pretty amazing offer to everyone that's listening to the show today. So what you're going to be doing is giving everyone a free Echo profile. So you'll see it on the screen here, echolisteningprofile.com/take-assessment, password Illumyx18. We will be sending you a link probably by tomorrow for you to access that assessment. It will be available for 1 week, so you don't have to fill it out right away, but that link will be active for 1 week. Any other details on what they'll be getting with that Echo profile, Dana?
Yeah, so the Echo profile is about 25 pages long. Certainly what we did today was fun, and it gave you a taste of the profile. It's 10 questions. It's a forced choice. It asks you things you do when you listen. And what it will actually give you as a result is a full profile that's 3 or 4 pages of who you are as a listener in your natural state at work. It will give you 5 or 6 points that will allow you to know if immediately you wanted to shift your listening, here are things you can do. And it will also show you how you integrate on teams with the other 4 habits. So depending on how your profile shows up, how you integrate and how you work with others, it'll show you at your best, some challenges you might have with different listening profiles, and how you might work through that. So it's very comprehensive. We think it can be very valuable, and we're thrilled to give it to everyone today through this audience.
And I recently took it maybe a few weeks ago, and it's been extremely helpful for me. I'm actually building out my team right now as we speak, and it's really getting me to reflect and go, okay, what are some different attributes I need on the team that are different from me and my current cohort, so to speak. And it's really been helpful to see, okay, if I want to grow this business, maybe I need more fact-based listening to help round out maybe growth areas for myself. So I think that's an awesome opportunity. So thank you, Dana, for making that available to our listeners. We do have time for a couple of questions before we wrap today. I have one for you. So in your experience, what would you say are are there like 2 typical listening habits that tend to create the most consternation or tend to conflict the most?
If you look at the 4 habits, connective is pretty straightforward. You know, as a facilitator, we see connective listeners sit in the front row. They'll lean in, they'll shake their head, make you feel as a facilitator you're doing a great job. Sometimes they aren't really listening to the contact, they're just looking to connect with you. When we get to reflective listeners, because they're in their head so much, what we find is they're very hard to read and most times misunderstood. So quite often you'll see them in a meeting and they're just slightly away from the table with others, and they've got their arms crossed, and their body language, like I said before, is kind of looking up. They could almost look slightly annoyed, maybe a little aloof and disconnected, when in reality, they're so connected to that information that they are in their head thinking things through. And all of a sudden, you could be 3/4 of the way through the meeting, or you could leave that meeting, and then they all of a sudden they want to dive in because they've figured it out. So that type of listener, Stephen, is the one that we work the most with on teams for them to be understood, for them to share their thinking earlier, for people to understand their body language from a different angle. So that's the one I would say that we get the most misunderstood, misread.
Yeah, and that your explanation makes a lot of sense. I've done a lot of team development work, and yeah, the paranoia that a reflective listener could create, yeah, it can be pretty significant. So before we wrap up, so it's we're at time. Before we wrap up, Dana, anything like where can people find you? Any things that you have coming up that you want people to be aware of? So this is your time to plug who you are and what you're about, and how people can get connected to you.
Yeah, I mean, we work with ATD, so we'll be over in New Orleans in the fall. We're the key sponsor of, is it American Training and Development? I can't remember the first word, but ATD. You know, we do some local talks here. I would say the thing that we like to plug the most is that don't underestimate listening. You know, we do the profile with groups and individuals. We do a half-day workshop. In the half-day workshop, we do this wonderful thing where you actually observe someone else's body language, because body language when we're listening looks totally different than body language when we're speaking. So we use our hands and we talk like this, but when we're listening, we do something very different. Listening has a lot of power, and I'd like to just leave people with the understanding that it is really 50% of the communication equation.
Cool. Well, thanks, Dana. I appreciate you coming on the show today. I learned a lot, and I hope everyone takes advantage of the listening profile that she's made available to you all today. So tune in next week, or sorry, not next week, next month. So June 28th, we're going to have our next CultureCast. It's all about agile team-based organizations. So I'm going to bring an expert on from a group called Centair, and he's going to talk about if you want to create an agile culture, how to do that, and what are the steps to make that happen. So it's a spin-off from our first show called The Anatomy of Teamwork. So how do you create really a team-driven organization? So it's going to be extremely informative, and looking forward to talking with you guys again. So thanks again, and we'll get a recording of this out to you over the next week. And everybody enjoy your day. Take care.